I always considered myself a lucky man. At 38, I had a stable job in a tech firm, a nice house in the suburbs, and, most importantly, a wife who was the envy of everyone I knew. Sarah was beautiful, the kind of woman who could light up a room just by walking into it. Her laugh was infectious, her smile disarming. We met 10 years ago at a work function. She was working in HR for another company, and I was there as a consultant. It didn't take long before we started dating, and within a year, we were married. We were that couple, the one everyone thought was perfect. I work long hours, and Sarah's job isn't much different. She transitioned into a more demanding role a few years back, managing a team of recruiters for a major corporation. We both agreed it was a good move. More money, more prestige. But with it came more stress and more time apart. We tried to make up for it on weekends, going out to dinners, hosting friends, trying to stay connected in the small windows of time we had. But if I'm being honest, something had shifted. I couldn't quite put my finger on it, but there was a distance growing between us that I couldn't ignore. Sarah had always been a social butterfly, always the center of attention. I used to love that about her, how she could charm anyone in a room. But lately, her socializing had become more frequent and more secretive. She'd get home later than usual, claiming she'd been out with friends or caught up in a late meeting. I didn't question it at first. Why would I? But the late nights became more frequent, the excuses more rehearsed. There were moments when I'd catch her texting late at night, the screen quickly turning off when I walked into the room. She'd smile, tell me it was just a friend, nothing important, but the doubts started creeping in. It's strange how little things, seemingly insignificant at first, can start to gnaw at you. A slight change in routine, a missed call, a text left unanswered. I started noticing how Sarah would go out of her way to look perfect, even on days when she had no meetings. She'd leave the house wearing a scent I knew she only wore on special occasions. She'd return home, still that same captivating woman I fell in love with. But there was a disconnect, something that didn't quite add up. I tried to brush it off, told myself I was being paranoid, that the stress of work was getting to me, and that she was just trying to unwind in her own way. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. It's amazing how the mind can play tricks on you, convincing you that everything is fine, even when your gut tells you otherwise. But then, there were the calls. They started a few months ago, late at night or early in the morning before she left for work. I never heard the conversations, just saw her talking in hushed tones, her back turned to me. I asked her about it once, and she brushed it off, saying it was work-related, nothing I needed to worry about. But the unease only grew. I found myself lying awake at night, staring at the ceiling, wondering if I was just imagining things, or if my perfect life was beginning to unravel. Sarah and I didn't have kids, something we both agreed on early in our relationship. We liked our freedom, the ability to travel, to go out whenever we pleased, but sometimes I wondered if that choice had created a void, a space between us that was now being filled by something or someone else. Our conversations, once effortless, now felt forced. I'd ask her about her day, and she'd give me the bare minimum, almost as if she was trying to hide something. The laughter, the inside jokes we used to share, were becoming a thing of the past. We still had sex, but even that had changed. It felt mechanical, like she was just going through the motions. I tried to shake off the feeling, but it lingered like a bad taste in my mouth. A few weeks ago, I decided to work from home for a day. Sarah had already left for the office, and I spent the morning catching up on emails and projects. Around noon, I stepped out to grab a coffee. As I was driving back, I saw her car parked outside a small cafe on the other side of town, far from her office. I pulled over, curiosity getting the better of me. Through the window, I saw her sitting with a man I didn't recognize. They were talking, laughing, and she looked happy. Happier than I'd seen her in months. She glanced around nervously, as if she didn't want to be seen. I stayed in my car, watching, my heart pounding in my chest. When she got home that evening, I didn't mention what I'd seen. I wanted to, but the words caught in my throat. Instead, I just watched her, trying to read her, trying to find any hint of guilt or remorse in her eyes. But there was nothing. She was her usual self, talking about her day, asking me about mine, as if nothing had happened. But I couldn't shake the image of her with that man, laughing, looking at him the way she used to look at me. The following week, she started, coming home even later. There were more texts, more hushed phone calls. I tried to keep calm, tried to act like everything was fine, but inside, I was unraveling. I couldn't help but feel like a fool, like I was losing her, and there was nothing I could do about it. I decided to take matters into my own hands. I needed to know if my suspicions were real or if I was just being paranoid. So, one evening, after she'd gone to bed, I picked up her phone. My hands were shaking as I scrolled through her messages. Most of them were innocuous, nothing that would raise an alarm. But then I found one, from a number not saved in her contacts. The conversation was brief, just a few lines exchanged, but it was enough. They were planning to meet again, the same place as before. I felt sick to my stomach. The realization that my wife, the woman I'd loved and trusted for so many years, was hiding something from me was almost too much to bear. I wanted to confront her right then and there, but something stopped me. I needed to see it with my own eyes. I needed to know the truth, no matter how painful it might be. I made a plan. I'd follow her the next time she left the house, find out where she was going, who she was meeting. If there was anything going on, I'd catch her in the act. I didn't know what I'd do when I found out, but I knew I couldn't keep living in the dark. The perfect life I thought I had was slipping through my fingers, and I was determined to get to the bottom of it, no matter the cost. The next morning, Sarah was getting ready for work as usual. I watched her from the bed as she meticulously applied her makeup, her hands moving with a practiced ease. She wore a fitted dress that hugged her in all the right places, the kind she used to wear when we went on dates. I couldn't help but wonder who she was really dressing up for. My heart raced, but I kept my composure, feigning disinterest as I scrolled through my phone. As she kissed me goodbye and left for work, I gave her a few minutes head start before grabbing my keys. I knew the route she usually took to her office, and I planned to trail her without being too obvious. My mind was in overdrive. If I was wrong about this, I'd look like a paranoid idiot. But if I was right, well, I wasn't sure what I'd do. I just knew I had to see it for myself. I kept a safe distance, my heart pounding in my chest as I followed her down familiar roads. But as we neared the exit for her office, she didn't take it. Instead, she continued driving down the highway, heading toward a quieter part of town, one I wasn't too familiar with. My suspicions deepened with every mile. She pulled off at a small exit and drove into a quiet neighborhood, finally stopping at a secluded cafe, one I recognized from before. The same cafe where I'd seen her with that man. I parked my car a few blocks away, far enough that she wouldn't notice me. My hands were clammy, my throat dry as I watched her get out of the car, checking her reflection in the window before heading inside. I waited for a few agonizing minutes, battling the urge to confront her right then and there. But I needed to see him. I needed to see them together, to confirm what I already knew in my gut. And then he appeared. Tall, dark-haired, and younger than me. He walked up to the cafe casually, like this was something they did all the time. As soon as he saw her, his face lit up. I watched as he leaned in, pulling her into an embrace. My heart sank. They didn't kiss, but the way she looked at him, like he was the only person in the world, was worse. It was the way she used to look at me. They went inside, and I couldn't see them anymore. My mind was racing, flashes of every excuse she'd ever given me playing on a loop in my head. The late meetings, the sudden texts, the way she'd pull away from me at night, All the pieces of the puzzle were finally falling into place, and it hurt more than I ever imagined. I sat there for what felt like hours, my thoughts a chaotic blur. What was I supposed to do now? Confront her here? Follow them? I didn't have to wait long for the answer. After about an hour, I saw them walk out of the cafe, heading toward his car. I couldn't believe she was being so brazen, so careless, or maybe she just didn't think I'd ever find out. He opened the passenger door for her, and she smiled at him, that same smile I used to get. They were laughing as she climbed into his car. The sound of the door slamming shut snapped me out of my daze. They started the engine and pulled out of the parking lot, driving toward the highway. I knew I had to follow them, had to see where they were going. My pulse quickened, hands gripping the wheel so hard my knuckles turned white as I stayed a few cars behind them. It didn't take long for me to realize where they were headed. One of those cheap motels on the outskirts of town. I watched as they pulled into the lot, her lover parking his car in a shaded spot at the far end. I parked a few spaces away, still out of sight, but close enough to see everything. Sarah leaned across the seat, her lips moving, whispering something to him. He smiled and shifted in his seat, clearly enjoying whatever she was saying. My stomach turned as I watched her lean over him. There was no mistaking what was happening. She was giving him a blowjob, right there in his car, like she didn't have a care in the world, like I didn't even exist. My heart felt like it had stopped. I couldn't breathe, couldn't move. Rage and disbelief surged through me in equal measure. How could she do this to me? To us? I felt like I was watching a nightmare unfold in slow motion. The woman I loved, desecrating everything we'd built together for some random guy. I must have made a noise, or maybe they saw me in their rearview mirror because suddenly her lover's eyes widened in panic. He pushed her off of him, fumbling with the keys as he scrambled to start the car. But I wasn't going to let them get away that easily. With adrenaline coursing through my veins, I floored the gas pedal, pulling out of my spot and racing after them. He was driving like a madman, swerving through traffic, trying to lose me, but there was no way in hell I was letting them go. Not after what I'd just seen. I caught up to them quickly. A sharp maneuver on my part, and I clipped the back of their car. The screech of tires filled the air as his car swerved, fishtailed, and then flipped, rolling off the road in a violent crash. My heart pounded in my chest, but I didn't stop. I pulled up alongside their wrecked car, my mind blank, my body moving on instinct. The car was upside down, its frame twisted and mangled. Her lover was lying on the pavement, blood pouring from a deep gash in his head. Sarah was still inside, unconscious, her body crumpled against the passenger door. For a moment, I just stood there, staring at the wreckage, at the life that had just imploded in front of me. My wife, the woman I thought I knew, was lying in a wrecked car next to her bleeding lover, and everything I thought we had was shattered beyond repair. For a few seconds, I stood frozen, my mind trying to process the scene in front of me. The adrenaline that had been coursing through my body was quickly replaced by a dull, heavy weight in my chest. The wrecked car, Sarah's limp body, her lover bleeding out on the asphalt. It all felt surreal, like something out of a bad dream. But this wasn't a dream. This was my life. I snapped out of it, stumbling toward the overturned car. The driver's side door was mangled beyond repair, metal twisted and crumpled from the impact. Her lover was groaning, his face a mess of blood and dirt. He looked at me, eyes wide with fear, but I couldn't muster any sympathy. The rage that had propelled me to chase them down flared up again. Part of me wanted to drag him out of the wreckage and beat him to a pulp for what he'd done, for what they had done together. But then I saw Sarah. She was slumped against the passenger door, her face pale, her body completely still. I rushed around to her side of the car, my heart pounding. The window was shattered, shards of glass scattered across the ground and her skin. Blood streaked down her forehead, her hair matted from the impact. I tried the door, but it was jammed shut. Panic set in. Sarah! I shouted, shaking the door, desperate to get her out. Sarah, wake up! She didn't move. My hands trembled as I pulled at the door handle again, adrenaline surging back through me. With one final, desperate yank, the door creaked open, and I carefully reached inside, pulling her out as gently as I could. She was unconscious, her body limp in my arms. I checked her pulse. Faint, but there. Relief washed over me for a split second before the anger returned. How had we gotten here? How had my life gone from normal, from boring even, to this? Just a few hours ago, I was at home, pretending that everything was fine, convincing myself that I was overreacting. Now, I was cradling my unconscious wife in the middle of a deserted road, next to a man who had been inside her in more ways than one. I laid her down on the grass, away from the wreck, my mind racing. I could hear sirens in the distance, growing louder by the second. My breath came in short, shallow bursts as I stood over her, watching her chest rise and fall slowly. She looked so fragile, so small, lying there like that. It was hard to reconcile this broken version of her with the confident, vibrant woman I thought I knew. The woman who had smiled at me every morning for the past 10 years. The woman who had just been with another man. The sirens grew closer, and soon the flashing lights of an ambulance and a police car filled the horizon. Paramedics rushed over, pulling me away from Sarah as they assessed her condition. I stepped back, numb, watching them work on her, trying to bring her back to consciousness. One of them asked me questions, but I barely registered what they were saying. Everything was a blur. They moved to her lover next, lifting his limp body onto a stretcher. He was alive, but barely. A part of me hoped he wouldn't make it. That bastard didn't deserve to live after what he'd done, after what they'd both done. As the paramedics loaded Sarah into the ambulance, one of the officers approached me. His face was serious, stern, but there was a hint of compassion in his eyes. "Sir, are you all right? What happened here?" I stared at him, my mind still racing. What was I supposed to say? That I'd caught my wife giving another man a blowjob, chased them down and caused the accident. I could see the wreckage in my peripheral vision, the shattered glass, the crumpled metal, the blood on the ground. It was all so damning. I don't know," I stammered, my voice hoarse. I saw them and I just—" The officer nodded, scribbling something in his notebook. "We'll need a full statement, but let's get you checked out first. You've been through a lot." He didn't know the half of it. As they loaded me into the back of a second ambulance, the reality of what had just happened began to sink in. The life I thought I had, the wife I thought I knew, was gone. Even if she survived this, nothing would ever be the same again. I didn't know what the future held, but I knew one thing for sure. There was no going back from this. As the doors of the ambulance closed and the engine roared to life, I leaned back against the cold metal of the stretcher, my mind swirling with anger, betrayal, and disbelief. The woman I had loved for a decade had destroyed me in a single afternoon, and now all I had left was the wreckage. The hospital was cold, that sterile, suffocating chill that settled in your bones. I sat in the waiting room, staring blankly at the white walls, my mind still reeling from everything that had happened. They'd taken Sarah into surgery almost immediately, and I hadn't seen her since. The doctors said she had suffered a head injury in the crash, and while they weren't sure of the extent yet, they were optimistic she'd pull through. Her lover hadn't fared as well. He was in intensive care, barely clinging to life. Part of me hoped he'd die, that his existence would be snuffed out like the scum he was. But the other part of me, the rational part, knew that his death wouldn't change anything. It wouldn't erase what I'd seen, what I knew. The betrayal was still there, seared into my mind, a permanent scar I'd carry with me forever. I couldn't shake the image of them in that car, her mouth on him, his hands tangled in her hair. It played in my head like a broken record, each repetition more agonizing than the last. A nurse came in and called my name, snapping me out of my thoughts. I followed her down the hall, my footsteps echoing off the polished floor. She led me to a private room where Sarah lay unconscious in a hospital bed. Tubes and wires ran from her body to machines that beeped and blinked rhythmically, the only sounds in the otherwise silent room. She looked so peaceful, so fragile. Her face was pale, her hair a mess, and her arm was bandaged from the crash. For a moment, the anger I'd felt all day subsided, replaced by a pang of something I wasn't sure I could even call love anymore. Pity, maybe, or just sorrow for the person she used to be. I stood at the foot of the bed, watching her sleep. My mind drifted back to the early days of our relationship, when everything was perfect. I remembered how she used to laugh at my dumb jokes, how she'd curl up next to me on the couch after a long day, her body warm against mine. We used to make love like nothing else in the world mattered, like we were the only two people in existence. I wondered when all of that had changed. When had she started pulling away? When had I started losing her? The door creaked open behind me, and a doctor stepped in, clipboard in hand. He glanced at Sarah, then turned to me with a somber expression. "She's stable for now," he said quietly. "The surgery went well, but it'll take some time for her to regain consciousness. We'll need to monitor her closely over the next few days." I nodded, my throat tight with emotion. Will she remember everything?" He hesitated, his brow furrowing. "It's hard to say. There's a possibility of memory loss due to the head trauma. It could be temporary, or it could be permanent. We'll know more once she wakes up." Memory loss. The words echoed in my head, bouncing off the walls of my mind. Would she remember the accident? Would she remember why it happened? Part of me hoped she wouldn't, that maybe, just maybe, we could pretend none of this had happened, that we could go back to the way things were before. But deep down, I knew that was impossible. Even if she forgot, I couldn't. The damage was done, and no amount of forgetting would undo it. The doctor left, and I sat down in the chair next to Sarah's bed, leaning forward, my elbows resting on my knees. The weight of everything that had happened pressed down on me, suffocating me. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know if I could forgive her, or if I even wanted to. All I knew was that the life I had known was over, and I was left standing in the ruins of what used to be. As I sat there, the door opened again, this time revealing two police officers. One of them was the officer who had spoken to me at the scene of the accident. His partner, a stern-looking woman with short-cropped hair, glanced at Sarah before focusing her attention on me. "Mr. Daniels," the male officer said, stepping into the room. "We need to talk." I nodded, my stomach tightening. I knew what this was about. They needed my statement. They needed to know what had led up to the crash, why I'd chased them down. They wanted to hear my side of the story. "We understand this is a difficult time," the female officer said, her voice firm but not unkind. "But we need you to explain what happened. We need to know the truth." The truth. That word felt like a punch to the gut. The truth was something I'd been avoiding for weeks, maybe even months. I'd been lying to myself, pretending everything was fine, when in reality, my marriage had been falling apart right in front of me. And now, it had all come crashing down, literally. I took a deep breath, my hands trembling as I rubbed my face. I followed them, I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. I followed her because I knew something was going on. I saw them, together, and I just lost it. The male officer raised an eyebrow, his pen hovering over his notepad. "You saw them together? Where?" "In his car," I said, the words bitter on my tongue. "They were parked outside that motel on the edge of town. I saw them. I saw her." The officers exchanged a glance, and the female officer leaned forward slightly. "And then?" I swallowed hard, the memory of the chase replaying in my mind. "I followed them when they tried to leave. I didn't mean for it to go this far. I couldn't let them get away." The officers were quiet for a moment, letting my words sink in. The male officer scribbled something in his notebook before looking up at me. "We'll need a formal statement from you down at the station," he said, his tone serious. "But for now, get some rest. We'll be in touch." They left the room, leaving me alone with Sarah once again. I stared at her, my chest tight with conflicting emotions. Anger, hurt, betrayal, and an overwhelming sense of loss. The woman lying in that hospital bed wasn't the same woman I had married. Or maybe she was, and I had just been blind to it all along. I leaned back in the chair, closing my eyes, the sound of the machines beeping softly in the background. I didn't know what the future held, but one thing was certain: nothing would ever be the same again. The days that followed felt like an eternity. Sarah remained unconscious in her hospital bed, and I was left with nothing but my thoughts and the endless beeping of machines to keep me company. The hospital staff moved in and out of the room, checking her vitals, adjusting her medication, but I barely noticed them. I was stuck in my head, replaying every moment of the past few weeks over and over again, trying to make sense of it all. I hadn't told anyone what had happened. I couldn't. How do you even begin to explain something like this? The truth was too raw, too ugly. The image of Sarah with her lover haunted me constantly, a twisted scene that replayed in my mind whether I wanted it to or not. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw them together, her lips on him, the intimacy that should have been reserved for me. And then the crash. The sound of metal twisting and glass shattering, her body crumpled against the door, his blood pooling on the pavement. The police had been by a few times, asking more questions, wanting more details. I gave them what they wanted, sticking to the facts, leaving out the part where my emotions had taken over and I'd practically caused the accident myself. They didn't press too hard, not yet anyway. But I knew they weren't finished with me, not by a long shot. I spent hours sitting by Sarah's bed, staring at her face, wondering what would happen when she woke up. Would she remember everything? Would she know what I'd seen? Or would she wake up with no memory of her betrayal, of the wreck, of the man she'd been cheating on me with? The doctors still didn't know the full extent of her injuries. The head trauma was severe, and they warned me that her memory might be fragmented, or worse, wiped clean of certain events. A part of me hoped she'd remember nothing, that we could pick up the pieces and pretend none of this had happened. But another part of me wanted her to wake up and feel the weight of what she'd done, to see the pain in my eyes and understand that she had destroyed everything. I hadn't been to work since the accident. I couldn't face anyone, couldn't pretend like my life hadn't just been turned upside down. I ignored the calls from my boss, from friends, even from Sarah's colleagues who were starting to ask questions about why she wasn't at the office. What was I supposed to say? That my wife had been screwing another man and I'd caught them in the act? That I'd chased them down like a madman and caused the crash that put her in the hospital? Instead, I sat there in silence, day after day, waiting for something to happen, for Sarah to wake up, for the police to charge me, for my life to move forward, one way or another. Then, one morning, something changed. I was dozing in the uncomfortable hospital chair, my body stiff from days of sitting in the same position, when I heard a soft noise. I blinked, groggy and disoriented, and looked over at Sarah's bed. Her hand was twitching, fingers curling slightly against the white sheets. My heart leapt into my throat, and I shot out of the chair, standing over her, watching as her eyelids fluttered. "Sarah," I whispered, my voice shaky. "Sarah, can you hear me?" Her eyes opened slowly, unfocused at first, blinking against the harsh light of the room. I stood there, holding my breath, waiting for her to say something. Anything. After what felt like an eternity, her gaze shifted toward me. She looked confused, disoriented, her brow furrowing as she tried to make sense of where she was. "What?" Her voice was weak, barely a whisper. "You're in the hospital," I said gently, trying to keep my voice steady. "There was an accident. Do you remember?" She blinked again, her eyes narrowing as she looked up at me, confusion deepening. "Accident?" Her voice was scratchy, and she winced as she tried to speak. I swallowed hard, my heart pounding. This was the moment I had been dreading and anticipating all at once. I needed to know what she remembered, but I was terrified of the answer. "Yeah," I said, taking a seat on the edge of the bed, my hands trembling. "There was an accident. You were in a car with someone. Do you remember who?" Her face scrunched up in pain, her hand coming up to her head as if she was trying to force the memories to come back. She winced again, her body tensing. I don't remember." The relief that washed over me was immediate and overwhelming. She didn't remember. At least, not yet. Maybe she never would. But as soon as that relief hit, guilt followed close behind. What kind of person was I, hoping that my wife's memory loss would erase her infidelity? I stared at her, this woman I had loved for a decade, and realized I didn't even know who she was anymore. She looked up at me, her eyes searching mine, and for a moment, I thought I saw something there. Fear? Guilt? Or maybe it was just the pain from her injuries. Either way, I couldn't shake the feeling that even if she didn't remember the accident, some part of her knew what had happened. Some part of her understood what she had done. The doctor came in shortly after, checking her vitals, asking her questions, and confirming that she would need time to recover. They still couldn't say for sure how much of her memory would return, but they seemed optimistic about her physical recovery. I stood by the window, staring out at the parking lot below, my mind racing. I couldn't escape the thought that this was my chance to leave, to walk away from the wreckage of our marriage and start over. She didn't remember, at least not yet, and maybe that was a gift. Maybe this was my opportunity to break free. But as I turned back towards Sarah, watching her lie in that hospital bed, weak and fragile, I realized I wasn't ready to make that choice. Not yet. There were still too many unanswered questions, too many unresolved emotions swirling inside me. I couldn't walk away, not until I knew for sure what the future held. I approached the bed again, and Sarah looked up at me, her eyes filled with exhaustion. She reached out, her hand trembling slightly as she found mine. I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice barely audible. For a moment, I thought she remembered everything, that she was apologizing for what she'd done. But then I saw the confusion in her eyes, the uncertainty. "I'm sorry for everything," she repeated, her voice cracking. I squeezed her hand, my heart heavy with the weight of everything left unsaid. "I know," I whispered back, unsure if I was lying to her or to myself. The days after Sarah woke up were strange. She was weak, her body still recovering from the trauma, but her mind seemed clearer with each passing day. Her memory, however, remained elusive. She remembered some things, our house, her job, bits and pieces of our life together, but the accident and everything leading up to it were a complete blank. The doctors called it retrograde amnesia, a common result of head injuries, they said. For now, there was no telling when or if those memories would return. I should have felt relieved, grateful even, but instead, I felt trapped between the desire to let things go and the burning need to confront her with the truth. There were moments when I'd catch myself staring at her, wondering if she was lying, if she was hiding something behind those blank, innocent expressions. But then I'd remember the accident, the way her body had been thrown like a rag doll inside the wrecked car, and guilt would consume me. Sarah didn't question much at first, content to follow the doctor's instructions and focus on her physical recovery. She was quieter now, more subdued than she'd ever been before. The woman who used to command rooms with her energy, her wit, seemed smaller somehow, shrunken by the weight of her own fragility. but it didn't take long for her to start asking questions. She wanted to know about the accident, about how it had happened, about the man who had been in the car with her. Her lover, whose name I hadn't bothered to learn, had survived the crash but remained in critical condition. The police had visited him in the hospital too, though I had no idea what they had uncovered. I hadn't asked. I didn't want to know. I dreaded the day Sarah would start to piece things together. I could feel it coming, like the quiet before a storm. The air around us was thick with unspoken words, and I knew she could sense the tension in me, even if she didn't understand why. Every time she mentioned the accident, every time she asked about the man she couldn't remember, my heart would start to race, my palms sweating as I scrambled to find answers that wouldn't give away the truth. "I was with someone, wasn't I?" she asked one evening, her voice hesitant. She was sitting up in bed now, stronger than she had been in the early days. Her hair was washed, her face no longer pale, but her eyes still held that clouded confusion, a constant reminder of the memories she had lost. I was sitting in the chair beside her, flipping through a magazine I wasn't really reading. Her question hit me like a punch to the gut, and I had to force myself to look up at her. "Yeah," I said, keeping my voice steady. "You were." Her brow furrowed, a shadow of worry crossing her face. "Who was he? Why can't I remember anything about him?" I could feel my chest tightening, the weight of the lie pressing down on me. I couldn't tell her the truth, not yet. I wasn't ready, and she wasn't either. "He was just someone you knew from work," I said, the lie slipping out more easily than I expected. "I don't know much about him. The police are still trying to figure things out." She looked down at her hands, twisting the blanket nervously between her fingers. Did I care about him?" Her question sent a jolt of anger through me, but I swallowed it down, forcing a calm expression. "I don't know," I lied again. "I don't think so." Her eyes flicked back up to mine, searching for something, anything, that would help her make sense of the blank spaces in her mind. But I couldn't give her that. Not now. Not when I wasn't sure what I wanted anymore. The days stretched on, and the tension between us grew. Sarah tried to pretend everything was normal, but I could see the cracks forming. She was getting restless, frustrated by her inability to remember. She started going through her phone, flipping through old photos, old messages, trying to jog her memory. I watched her, my heart in my throat, praying she wouldn't find anything that would lead her to the truth. One afternoon, while she was still asleep, I went through her phone myself. I hadn't touched it since the accident, hadn't wanted to face whatever evidence might be hidden in there. But now, with her asking more questions every day, I couldn't help myself. I needed to know what she knew, or what she might uncover. My hands shook as I scrolled through her messages, my stomach churning. Most of the conversations were innocent enough, chats with friends, colleagues, nothing out of the ordinary. But then I found it. A thread of texts with an unsaved number, the one I had seen before, the one I had ignored in the hope that it was just a misunderstanding. I clicked on it, and the truth hit me like a freight train. "Can't wait to see you later. Same place. I miss you. Last night was amazing. You're incredible. I've never felt like this with anyone before." The words burned into my brain, each message a new wound. There were photos too, some of them innocent, others less so. Pictures of them together, her smiling in a way I hadn't seen in months, maybe years. Pictures of them in bed, wrapped around each other, limbs tangled in a way that was far too familiar. I dropped the phone, my heart pounding in my chest. There it was, the undeniable proof of everything I had suspected but hadn't wanted to believe. My wife had been cheating on me, and now I had the evidence staring me in the face. The worst part was, she didn't even remember. I stood there, staring at the phone on the bed, my mind spinning with 1,000 different thoughts. I could confront her now. I could throw the phone in her face and demand answers. But what good would that do? She didn't remember. She couldn't explain herself. She was living in a reality where none of this had ever happened. And yet, here I was, trapped with the knowledge that it had. I picked up the phone, shoved it back into her purse, and left the room without a word. I needed air, space, anything to escape the suffocating weight of what I had just discovered. I stepped outside the hospital, the cool breeze hitting my face as I leaned against the wall, closing my eyes. I was torn between two worlds, the world Sarah was living in, where we were still just husband and wife, trying to rebuild after a tragic accident, and the world I had just uncovered, the one where she had betrayed me in the most intimate way possible. I didn't know how much longer I could keep living in both. The tension was unbearable. Every moment I spent with Sarah felt like a lie, the truth gnawing at me from the inside. I'd look at her, lying there in her hospital bed, her face a mix of confusion and worry, and I'd feel a rush of conflicting emotions, anger, betrayal, sadness. But then there was the guilt. Guilt because she didn't remember. Guilt because part of me wanted her to stay in the dark, to live in a world where none of this had happened. But I couldn't keep it up. The weight of what I knew was crushing me. And every time she asked another question, every time she tried to piece together the fragments of her memory, I felt like I was going to explode. I had to tell her. I had to confront her, no matter how much it would hurt. One evening, when the hospital was quiet and visiting hours were coming to an end, I decided I couldn't wait any longer. I stood by the window, staring out into the night, gathering the courage to do what needed to be done. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat echoing in my ears as I tried to find the right words. Sarah was sitting up in bed, reading a book. She looked so peaceful, so unaware of the storm brewing inside me. But I couldn't let that fool me anymore. I turned around, my hands clenched into fists, and walked over to her. "Sarah," I said, my voice steady but barely above a whisper. She looked up at me, her eyes wide with concern. "What is it?" I took a deep breath, feeling the air catch in my throat. "We need to talk." There it was, the phrase that signaled the end of everything. Her expression shifted, a mix of fear and confusion clouding her eyes. She put the book down, her hands trembling slightly as she folded them in her lap. "What's going on?" she asked, her voice tinged with worry. I couldn't dance around it anymore. I had to rip off the Band-Aid, no matter how much it hurt. "I know about him," I said, my voice firmer now. "I know about the affair." The color drained from her face, her eyes widening in shock. "What? What are you talking about?" "The man you were with in the car," I continued, my anger bubbling up despite my best efforts to keep it under control. "He wasn't just some colleague or friend. You were having an affair with him. I've seen the messages, the photos. I know everything." Sarah's mouth opened, but no words came out. She just stared at me, her face pale, her eyes filled with a mixture of confusion and fear. I could see the gears turning in her mind, trying to process what I was saying, trying to remember something that her brain refused to give up. "You've been lying to me," I said, my voice rising as the anger took over. "For how long, Sarah? How long have you been sneaking around behind my back, pretending like everything was fine while you were screwing someone else?" Tears welled up in her eyes, and she shook her head, her hands trembling. I don't remember," she stammered, her voice breaking. "I swear I don't remember any of it." "Convenient, isn't it?" I spat, the bitterness in my words surprising even me. "You don't remember, so it's like it never happened, right? But it did, Sarah. You betrayed me. You destroyed everything we had, and now you're sitting there, playing the victim, pretending like you don't know what I'm talking about." "I'm not pretending," she cried, the tears streaming down her face now. "I swear to God, I don't remember. Please, you have to believe me." I wanted to believe her. wanted so desperately to think that this was all some terrible misunderstanding, that the woman I had loved for so long couldn't have done something so cruel. But the evidence was there, undeniable, staring me in the face every time I closed my eyes. I turned away from her, unable to look at her anymore. "You don't have to remember," I said, my voice cold. "Because I do. I remember everything, and I can't just pretend that none of it happened." The silence in the room was deafening. I could hear her sobbing quietly behind me, could feel the weight of the truth pressing down on both of us. But I didn't turn around. I couldn't. If I looked at her, if I saw the pain in her eyes, I knew I'd break. "Do you still love him?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. The question hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. I didn't want to hear the answer, but I needed to know. I needed to understand how deep this betrayal went. She didn't respond immediately, and for a moment, I thought she wouldn't. But then, in a voice so small I almost didn't hear it, she said, "I don't know." The words hit me like a physical blow, knocking the wind out of me. I closed my eyes, trying to steady myself, trying to keep the tears from spilling over. But it was too late. The dam had broken, and everything I'd been holding back, all the pain, the anger, the betrayal, came rushing to the surface. "I loved you," I said, my voice shaking with emotion. "I gave you everything, and you threw it all away for what? For some cheap thrill? For someone who didn't even care enough to stay by your side when things went wrong?" "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice choked with sobs. "I'm so sorry." Sorry. The word felt meaningless, hollow. Sorry wouldn't fix what she'd done. Sorry wouldn't erase the images burned into my mind, the betrayal that had shattered everything we'd built together. "I don't know if I can forgive you," I said finally, my voice barely audible. "I don't know if I can ever look at you the same way again." She didn't say anything, just sat there, her body shaking with sobs. I stood there for a moment longer, the weight of the truth pressing down on me like a lead blanket. Then, without another word, I turned and walked out of the room, leaving her behind, leaving everything behind. As I stepped out into the hallway, the tears I'd been holding back finally broke free. I leaned against the wall, my body trembling with the force of my emotions. The life I'd known, the love I'd cherished, was gone. All that was left was the hollow, aching emptiness that her betrayal had left behind.